All right, so we're on week 3 of our study of the kings and prophets of Israel. It's this week we're focusing on King Solomon, which is which is the son of David. As we have been doing, I'll include a map just so we can get a idea of the size of the kingdom of Israel under Solomon's reign. We get Israel is the largest it will be. It is reaching all the way down from the Red Sea, which is at its most southern point, and it's touching the Euphrates River, which in today's terms is reaching from Egypt all the way to Iraq. And so it's filling in this area surrounding the Jordan. They have, at this time, they've almost completely conquered at least a majority of the Philistine territory. There is a small bit that is not conquered, but that small bit kind of repeats itself in showing up. And then also they don't. There's no conquering of further up the western seaboard that borders the Mediterranean Sea. And again, like we have been doing, I've included kind of a family tree. It's very similar to last week's because it's the exact same as last week's. Last week we were talking about David. This week we are talking about Solomon. And so I think all I did was remove David's father and his brothers so that we can just kind of focus on Solomon. And this week, the important characters are David, because where we'll start, he'll still be king very briefly, and then Adonijah and Solomon will show up. And Rehoboam is mentioned, but he's not really on the scene by the time we'll end. So we open up in 1 Kings 1. 1 Kings 1, we kind of get a recap of what happens at the end of 2 Samuel. And what is happening is David is growing old. He's no longer really effectively a king. He's king until he stops breathing, basically. He's on his last limb. And so Adonijah, the older brother of Solomon, begins to rally favor to his claim to be king. Adonijah is not a child of Bathsheba. He's a child of Abigail. And so Adonijah is rallying those the generals who are supportive of his claim to the throne. He's rallying the people of Jerusalem. He's already starting to make his appearance seem like that of a king. We get a story of he's led through the streets of Jerusalem, following a band who's playing trumpets, and the generals are leading his horse through, and people are crying, "This is the king, this is the king." But upon hearing this, Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, comes to David with Solomon and Nathan, and Nathan's the prophet that served with David. And what we see is Bathsheba is similar to kind of modern politics, is looking out for her family and her son, and begs David as he's dying, or near death at least, don't name Adonijah as your heir. Name Solomon to be your heir, and name my son to be heir. And so where we ended off last week was this moment, and David names Solomon to be heir. Solomon becomes king because he receives David's blessings. The prophet Nathan then goes forth and rallies whoever he can find so that he can anoint Solomon as soon as possible. However, what we hear about sort of around the time of David starting to die, Adonijah becomes afraid. He's afraid that his brother is going to act wickedly against him, and so he's trying to remain in favor of Solomon. And so he goes before and he asks Solomon. David has this nurse, basically, who's been tending to him, and she's a young woman. Solomon, please let me marry this woman and I will go away. I won't be a problem to you ever again. Let me just let me have a wife and leave. But what Solomon does is say, no, who are you to claim that this woman should be your wife? Who are you saying, uh, who are you to demand anything of me? And so Adonijah becomes afraid. And what happens is he flees and claims, he grabs onto the altar of God, where the generals who have now swayed or have joined Solomon's side come and strike down Adonijah. This causes a problem with uncleanliness, and it's one of the first things that really the prophet Nathan, who's not really involved a lot in what Solomon does, Nathan has to then lead Solomon as he is still a young boy into leading this purification of this altar that was built for God in Jerusalem. So then David dies. Solomon is anointed king, similar to how his father was, and Saul was, and all these kings before him. Taken oil out of a ram's horn, poured it on his head. This picture is a little weird because it looks like he's being anointed by a Viking, but it was, I guess, one of the better pictures we had. Are you trying? And so Solomon is now king. Solomon is one of the only kings that presides. Actually, he's the only king that presides over a time of peace in Israel. As I mentioned a couple weeks ago, there's some people like, well, no, David did that. David had peace, but as we saw last week, there was a lot of reign started. He wasn't when he was anointed as a child. He was still then having to fight his rival Saul. Then when he was anointed over Judah, he saw Ishbosheth in the north. Whereas Solomon, he doesn't really have any rivals that prop up really until the end of his reign. Part of this is because he's now killed all of his older brothers, or not killed. He killed his one older brother, Adonijah. What we have is the older sons of David, which I included here, Amon and Absalom. They've already they left the picture last week, and just based off how the kingdom of Israel was going, they weren't going to have a queen, Tamar, so they anoint Solomon. And since Solomon is reigning in this time of peace, he's seen kind of differently as a king. It's even seen differently by God. There's this story of God comes to Solomon in a dream and says, Solomon, what do you want? What if you could have anything? You've presided over this time of peace. You've grown in stature. You've become a man similar to after my own heart, similar to your father David. What do you want? And some will argue that this was a test by God. Some will say God was testing him because, well, if he chooses strength, okay, God does give strength, but it would have been very short-lived. But that's not what Solomon asked for. Solomon asked for wisdom. Solomon asked for wisdom, and so he's blessed with wisdom. And so the stories we get of Solomon are examples of him really demonstrating this wisdom. The one that I think we all kind of get, or at least we can point to a little bit better, is the two women who are fighting over the one baby. The story goes, Solomon is reigning. He's sitting in his palace holding the open court like kings usually do. And two women come before him. They're arguing over one baby. And each says that the baby is theirs and that the other one killed their baby while they slept. And so Solomon, hearing the case of these two women, their stories seem to be the exact same. No, this woman stole my baby while I was sleeping and put her baby in there that she had killed accidentally when she rolled over him. So this is still my baby. She stole it. No, she stole it. And it goes back and forth. And it's always, I don't know if it was weird to you guys, but the solution Solomon came up with of, okay, I'm going to cut the baby in half, always seemed kind of weird to me because it seemed like a very quick jump to violence. But it does show some wisdom as it did get cut to the point. There's no arguing. If there was a woman who this was truly their child, and whatever motherly instinct there is, would rather see the child live than to be cut in half and only get half of the dead baby. And so that's kind of one of the only stories that we get outside of the writings of Solomon. Because what we get from Solomon and his wisdom, though it may not be stories of battles, stories of great accomplishments, similar to David, where he was killing giants, he was winning battles when he was outnumbered. What Solomon is known for is he was a writer. He wrote books of the Bible. The three we often attribute to Solomon is Songs of Songs, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes. They're all very different in their subject material. However, they're all attributed to Solomon. But one thing that we don't always recognize is really there's 6 books that are attributed to Solomon. So in addition to the Songs of Songs, Proverbs, and Ecclesiastes, there's the Odes of Solomon, the Psalms of Solomon, and the Wisdom of Solomon. These are all attributed to him in some way or fashion. They're not in our Bible. It's just those 3. And there's various reasons. First, the Odes of Solomon, they're attributed to King Solomon. However, the scholars really don't know what to do with it. Style-wise, it matches up. Material-wise, it kind of fits what a wise king would be saying. But what happens is when they look at the copies that they have, some of the grammar signs show that it's not coming out of a Hebrew text, but rather it's coming out of a Greek text. And Solomon did not speak Greek. He didn't write Greek. There weren't Greek scribes in Israel. They were Hebrew scribes. Likewise, the Psalms of Solomon is just a series of psalms that would be outside of our 150 psalms that we see. Some of them kind of sneak in some versions of the Greek Old Testament that was written in Alexandria. Some of the Psalms of Solomon sneak in there. And I don't know about you guys, but I think when I was going through Sunday school, the ladies who were teaching always got Psalms of Solomon mixed up with Songs of Songs or Songs of Solomon, which is not what they are, because they're very similar to the Psalms of David, and it's very clear that what he was doing was trying to do the same kind of religious practice, this personal relationship with God, and he was trying to write down his prayers like David did. And then finally, we get the Wisdom of Solomon. It's also sometimes called the Book of Wisdom. This is one that actually has more use by the Christian traditions. It's similar to Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. However, it's dealing with a lot more of the theological issues that Solomon was wrestling with. Things like death, what happens when you die, where is God exactly? Does he actually live on earth, or like the Canaanites would claim that their gods do, or and so Solomon's wrestling with this. But this book, it's not necessarily recognized by Protestants, but it is recognized by Catholics and Greek Orthodox Christians. Doesn't necessarily mean one of us got it right, one of us got it wrong. It's just one of those, they have reasons for thinking it's part of the Bible. We have reasons to think it's not. And some of those reasons are better than others. But another thing Solomon does is he builds the temple. And it's very, the account of how he's supposed to build the temple is very detailed. It's most of the story of Solomon. Solomon's time or reign spans from First Kings to First Kings 1 to First Kings 11, and at least 8 of those chapters are talking about the temple. The temple is supposed to be set up of several courts, and there's supposed to be altars. There's supposed to be an outer court in which Gentiles are able to be, and then there's the outer court where the Gentiles or women can be. You have the inner or upper court where Jewish men can be, and then you have the inner courts where only the priests and the Levites would be able to go. When we switch this over to the New Testament times, when they rebuild the temple under Nehemiah, what happens is this inner chamber is where the Pharisees and Sadducees would also be allowed to go. Just to kind of give that update. But in this time, it's supposed to be, there's 12 menorahs that are supposed to line these walls. There's supposed to be even a door that's separating the inner chamber from this place where the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant is resting. The Ark of the Covenant is surrounded by 2 large cherubim, which are throne guardians. It's very similar to how houses are kind of set up. You have your courtyard, and then you got your inside, and you're slowly working towards a throne room. And so this is a throne room for God that's being built. One thing that's interesting is the temple kind of mirrors the tabernacle. The tabernacle, we get a very clear explanation in Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers of how many times they're supposed to set things up, where they're supposed to set them up. And likewise, there's an outer gate where women and Gentiles can go. Then there's an inner court where Jewish men can go, and then there's the holy court where only the priests and the Levites are able to go. This is where Moses can go, and Moses is one of the only people who actually get to go into that final inner chamber where the Ark of the Covenant is. He doesn't necessarily get to go in there fully. He gets to walk in backwards, and he sees the light shine from behind him on the wall. But it's a tent, and we can kind of see some of the shapes are the same. This one shows the shapes a little bit better, but you have an altar that's set up in the middle. This one's the tabernacle, that one's the temple. You have an altar that's set up in the court for the women and the Gentiles area. You have a brazen layer, which is used for sanctification. The next layer in with the men, and then you slowly work yourself into the same kind of setup for the rooms, which all of these kind of follow the same pattern because it's showing the same kind of focus of the people, and you slowly get less and less people the closer you are to God. That's not to say, I guess we could say, because Jesus says it's a straight and narrow. Not everyone's going to ever get into that point where they're with God. I don't necessarily think that's what this is showing, but it's kind of showing that same pattern of, sure, the people, there's a ton of people that are just outside the temple. They're outside the grace of God, but the closer you get, that path becomes more straight and narrow. But this is also seen going back even further in Exodus with Mount Sinai, because you have the people at the bottom, and you're moving as you go up the mountain, you reach God. And it's that same pattern that just keeps appearing, the people, and you get closer to God with less people. I don't know if that's making good sense, but I'll stop here. Do you guys have any questions? Don't just keep trying.
Do you remember how many years it took to build the temple? I was just wondering in terms of the chapters, how many I forget how many years that correlated to.
I want to say, well, here, let me pull it up. So that would be should be First Kings.
7 years.
Yeah, that sounds right. Yeah, yeah, 7 years. Now, because it's 7 years to build the temple, and it takes, I want to say, 13 or 14 years to build the temple of, not the temple of Solomon, the palace of Solomon. And so, just because, and that's one of those things I always thought weird of God's. They're building this super ornate temple for God. It takes them only 7 years to build it. They dedicate it in 7 days. They spend another 7 days. Well, they spend 7 days purifying it and 7 days dedicating it. But then it takes them twice as long to just build the king's house. And so it kind of shows. It goes to show whether you want to say, well, God was showing His grace and how He was working through it. We can. We can. Well, this kind of leads us to where we are now. The description of the temple and how it's supposed to be set up is described to Solomon, but then we get the story of the king of Tyre comes to Solomon and says, your father paid for all of this material for us, because if we think back, David wanted to be the one to build the temple. He was the one who was zealous for God and had this passion, and it was his pet project. And so he was going to be the one, okay, God, if I can't do it, at least let me pay for it. Let me take care of the materials beforehand. And so the king of Tyre comes to Solomon. And you can kind of see some of those points of the king of Tyre could have easily just said, I don't remember getting paid. And double charge Solomon. That's one of those, you kind of see God's hand working through the temple being built, and not necessarily his hand through the palace being built for Solomon. And you also have to think Solomon was probably just building a house and didn't know what he wanted in it. And the builder would always say, well, what about if you want a room this size? And Solomon said, well, that does sound nice. I do want to build a room that size. And they're like, all right, that's going to take another year. And so, whereas God was very specific, you're not, I'm giving you the instructions, do not change them, do not mess with them. And so, it's just those small things. The king of Tyre supplies, or David paid for the supplies that the king of Tyre then delivers. It's one of the first times that we kind of get a hint of Israel now has like a pseudo navy, because they're using waterways to transport this from Tyre. If we look back at the map, Tyre is on the coast, the northern coast of what would now be Lebanon. And they're using boats to move it down to this valley, because then they can just take it down and then they move it down through the Jordan. And so it's a lot easier than trying to carry these great timbers and great stones through the middle of a mountain range. I was reminded of this because I saw a video about it, because it was two guys debating, and one of them was one of those, the Bible can't be real, right? Because, well, clearly there's errors, and not because he was necessarily reading it the way it was supposed to be read, but he was just reading it and looking at a map and saying, well, it was the Gospel of Mark, and you have a story of Jesus on the coast, and he goes up to Tyre and then down again before returning to the Sea of Galilee, or Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee. But what we miss is, and the preacher pointed this out, of there's a mountain range right there that if you just go straight, it would take you 3 times as long to go on this journey. And that was just on foot, let alone trying to transport stones that have to be quarried outside of a certain range of Jerusalem, because we'll see this in Nehemiah, which we won't cover in this class, but in Nehemiah you see this as Nehemiah's commanded the stones for rebuilding the temple have to be built, have to be cut so far away, because the site of where the temple is supposed to be built is supposed to be silent. You're not supposed to be doing a whole lot of loud construction work on the temple in the city of Jerusalem. Like it's supposed to be a reverent building, and so it's one of those you have to. Nowadays, we have prefabricated buildings, and so it's kind of that same idea of you have to have it almost ready built and then move it. And if you've ever tried to see those prefabricated buildings, it takes multiple semi trucks driving them down the highway, but they don't have semi trucks and they don't have highways. So trying to get them over a mountain range would be extremely difficult. And so again, we kind of see Israel is now having some form of ship-faring ability or naval capacity, not necessarily as a means of war, because they're no match to other civilizations that will use ships, but also most of Israel is mountainous and it's in a valley between those mountains, and so it would never really be super advantageous for anyone to try and invade Israel with boats. So, did that answer your question, Trent?
Yeah, that's very interesting.
So as I mentioned, Solomon, they finished building it, and they spend 14 days going through the temple purification process, to where it's no longer just a really ornate building with rooms, but it's a now clean place. It's similar to when you have a guest coming over, you clean your house up, but to the point of they're inviting God to make his presence rest in this place. So it's they're going above and beyond the cleaning, the sacrifices, to purify this temple. And then they spend 7 days basically in worship and prayer dedicating this temple. It becomes the place that God's presence will dwell until I believe it is, I want to say it's 7th century BC, or is it 6th? The BC centuries always throw me off because they don't work the same as the 80 centuries. It's one of those two. It's the time of Jeremiah. It's what we're studying on Sunday mornings. It's that same, at the end of Jeremiah, the presence of God leaves the temple. Whereas here, God is entering the temple. He is making it the place where he resides. And so this temple is ornate. It's the crown jewel for the time. I don't like how they demonstrated the temple in this picture, because they made it really tall up front for some reason. They made it look like a skyscraper. That's not what the temple would have looked like. Again, it looked more boxish. But this kind of, I like this picture because it shows just how much Solomon built in the city of David, Jerusalem. And because David built the walls in a small palace, his palace would have been right under where Solomon's palace was, and that was kind of it. And that was where the walls ended. But under Solomon, he extends the walls, he levels out kind of this mountaintop, so the temple can be on it. And he builds all these great monumental works, which again, when you're a king over a time of peace, it's really easy to do because you never have to leave to go fight wars. So Solomon's seen as this great builder as well. He's this great writer. He's this great judge figure, but he's also this great builder. He builds up he builds up the ancient civilization. So likewise, kind of in a more, I guess, in comparing it to other things, It's similar to how certain pharaohs stick out in Egyptian history because they were the ones to build certain temples or the pyramids, and uh, the Caesars stick out by how many monuments they built in Rome, and how they're more of the builders than the warriors. But we also always remember the warriors because they're the ones who have more things to write about them. Yeah, the list of buildings doesn't quite fill the pages the same way as the list of battles and the stories of great successes. And so, for the first bit of Solomon's kingship, we see he's being blessed by God. He's being blessed with wisdom, peace. But what happens is we get this fair lady, I guess you could call it, the Queen of Sheba comes. And you may be wondering where Sheba is. Sheba is this brownish orange area. It's kind of difficult. It's what would be modern day Yemen. It's on the Arabian Peninsula. And so it's that area. And so she comes from across Arabia basically to come see Solomon. Because the similar to how the legends of who David was, this great warrior king, has kind of spread through the regions. Likewise, the stories of Solomon's wealth and this wisdom, this wise king, the legend has gone before him. He doesn't have to go and visit all these places, but if he were, they would know him. It's similar to sports stars today. LeBron James or Michael Jordan or any of those guys, they can't leave the country and people not know who they are. Their faces on billboards, they don't ever have to play in these countries, but they know who they are. Likewise, the same thing's happening, just it's probably not billboards in the way we think of it, but stories have spread. And what she does is she comes and she brings gifts, and then at this time, Solomon has been married to the daughter of Pharaoh for a political alliance. She hasn't really necessarily been the one to bear children that we know, but Solomon also ends up with 700 wives, and the Queen of Sheba ends up being one of the more influential ones, just because as the Queen of Sheba comes before Solomon, she praises him, she kind of stokes the ego, and so Solomon decides to marry the Queen of Sheba. Then we start to see kind of the downfall of Solomon, because as he marries more and more foreign wives, what happens is he begins inviting in their gods into Jerusalem as well. He begins building altars and statues of their god, of his wives' gods, and he rather would worship these idols, these statues that have been built, rather than going into the temple that he had built early on and praising God. And so what happens is God decides to raise up three men to kind of challenge Solomon, to make it to where the end of his reign is not as peaceful. They're to be raiding parties, basically. It's not raising up a nation. But the first one is Hadad, the Edomite. This one, Hadad, I feel like we kind of don't talk about Edom really ever. Edom is this kind of the southeastern portion of the kingdom of Solomon. It's now what would be southwestern part of the kingdom of Jordan in today's terms. If any of you, the place where Indiana Jones finds the Holy Grail in The Last Crusade, Petra, the desert temple, that's built by the Edomites, or generations after the Edomites. They no longer call themselves the Edomites by that point, but it's that region of the world. And so the Edomites come from Esau, whereas the Israelites come from Jacob and Ishmaelites come from Ishmael. Esau's descendants become the nation of the Edomites. They're always described as having red hair. Similar to Esau, they're more or having a reddish appearance. They're more of a physically strong group. But what had happened with Hadad was Hadad was a prince at the time during the time of David. But David appointed his general Joab. Joab went through and kind of took care of enemies of David. David didn't necessarily have to be the one leading these battles because it would be similar to sending in like the National Guard to put down a riot. Not saying it's the same result, because what Joab ends up doing is he kills all of the families of the Edomites except Hadad, who had fled to Egypt in the middle of the night. And what ends up happening is similar to, we can think of the stories of Joseph, who's kind of, we can think of several stories of, from the Old Testament and even the New Testament of this prince, this king who flees because not a religious leader, a military leader seeks their life, and they flee into Egypt, and then they reside there. They find favor amongst Pharaoh's household, and then they have to go and return. This story shows up several times. I always found it interesting that, or at least I found it interesting that Hadad is kind of getting this treatment, just because we think of Isaac went through this when he fled Esau. Joseph went through this not because he was fleeing, but he was sold into slavery, and then he's the reason why you have the Exodus, because the Israelites come and go to Egypt. They find favor with the Pharaoh for a brief time, and then they have to leave. We have Jesus Christ who flees Herod because Herod is seeking to put to death this possible Messiah, and so he flees to Egypt. They flee to Egypt, and then they find favor amongst the ruler of Egypt, but they have to eventually make their return back to Israel. And so Hadad is kind of putting this forth, this raiding party, the southern portion of Israel and Solomon's kingdom. And then we get, want to say, this one's always hard to read. It's Rezin of son of Eliada, and in 1 Kings 11, we kind of get a story of who Rezin is, similar to Hadad. What we have is this was an enemy of David. Joab was sent to go put them down, to make them to where they weren't challenging David. And for the most part, what had happened was they had fled to Damascus, which is nowadays this capital of Syria. But at this time, it's now under the kingdom of Israel. And you have Rezin, who is he's the leader now because all of his clansmen have been killed off. But David, God has now raised up this enemy to challenge Solomon. And so he is challenging Solomon in Damascus and is really weakening Solomon's ability to govern in the north. And then we get to probably not the more important one, the most important one, Jeroboam, son of Nebat. He is of the tribe of Ephraim. It's not on the map, so I kind of squeeze it in there. But this is the central area. Ephraim is just north of where Jerusalem is. And so not only is Solomon fighting these, I guess we can consider them Gentiles in the north and south, now he has this Jew who's in the heartland of Israel kind of leading this raiding party against him. And what we get is the prophet Ahijah, who we don't really hear much about. He comes to Ahijah, and because of what Solomon has done, and we haven't gotten to what Rehoboam does, but Rehoboam will come on the scene next week. Because of what is happening, he comes to Jeroboam and says, Jeroboam, it's not, he tears his garment into 12 pieces. It says, Jeroboam, you take 10, God will keep one, meaning the tribe of Levi, and the other one will be left to Solomon and his house. Because God is tearing away the kingdom from the hand of Solomon because of the wicked things he has done. He has turned his back against God. Though he has been blessed with wisdom, though he has been the one to build the temple, to do all these wonderful things, he has lost favor in the eyes of God because of this. So you will take the northern tribes. You will lead the 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel. You will become the king in the north. And Solomon, will remain king of Judah, because that is what is owed to him, because he is the son of David. And God, we see again, God is a God of covenants in this moment. God does not want to break his covenant with David. He has promised David the kingdom of Israel will never pass from your children's hands. The kingdom, the promised king will be a son of David, which I think I mentioned last week. There's actually two sons of David that are in the line of Jesus, and that's Solomon and Nathan. Don't really ever hear anything about Nathan other than he's a younger brother of Solomon, and that's about it. And then we get his appearance in Luke's genealogy of Christ. But it's still that idea of God does not let, though he's deciding, Solomon, you kind of have to get punished. Solomon, you've done wrong. I'm tearing this away and I'm giving it to this Ephraimite who I've raised up. Which kind of leads us into where we'll be next week. And it's considered the Cold War period because early on, especially in the first couple kings, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom cannot stand each other. It's similar to what we see with the Samaritans and the Jews. Well, this is where it all starts here. Jeroboam sets up his capital in Samaria. You have the Jews who have their capital in Jerusalem. All those small underpinnings of what happens, or that cause the disciples to hate going through the area of Samaria, all that starts in this time of the Cold War. It's the only time they actually, it says Cold War, but unlike the Cold War between the United States and the USSR, they actually do come to blows against each other. And so, but that's more of Jeroboam and Rehoboam. So that's kind of where Solomon ends off. He dies kind of off screen. It's just next week we will read it, and from now on there's going to be a lot more reading, just because there's so much more. There's like one story in, so you might as well read it and not just have me recap it. But it's Solomon dies and Rehoboam becomes. That's almost verbatim what it said. And so that's where we'll pick up next week. You guys have any questions? Anything that's you want clarification on?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. No, I was just gonna say, looking at their temple, I was sitting there thinking when you was talking about the temple, it reminds me of the Mormons, they have their temple.
Yeah.
But it's nothing like that temple.
Yeah.
I don't know that this temple, I guess it's where the king stayed.
This was they built this for God, and so it's you had the Ark of the Covenant would rest in it, and the idea is the Ark of the Covenant is like the throne for God. So God, though you can't see him, he's resting there and he's presiding over his palace or temple. It gets tricky because it's a palace, but because it's for God, it's a temple, and it gets all messy. But yes, there is it's described when they rebuilt the temple under Nehemiah. And even it's referenced in the Jewish histories when they talk about when Herod, Herod the Great, when he repairs the temple, how even these repairs or rebuildings of the temple, nothing has or ever will ever match the magnificence of what Solomon built in this time. Could we say that's true still now? Because we have had great marvels of engineering. We built great buildings. I don't know. I don't know if our standard would necessarily stand up, but the way they frame it is because especially the popular Jewish historian Josephus is writing in this time of Rome. He's been to Rome. He's seen the Colosseum and its magnificence. He's seen the palaces of Caesar and all these temples that they've built and all the works Rome's built. And he's still saying, well, not even Roman architecture has ever been to the point of matching what Solomon ever built. So this idea of what Solomon has built probably stands up. I think that again goes to show this was truly a place where God had his influence. God was behind those small little details of making sure everything lined up and it worked out just perfectly. And of course it happened in 7 years, and because that's the number of completion. It's not just being thrown up in a minute. It's not taking. It took half the time it took to build for Solomon to build something smaller than this. Solomon's palace, no, it's bigger than that. Not palace. David's palace. Solomon's palace took 13 years, 14 years to build, but the temple, which is bigger than that, took only 7. And so again, I think we can beat this point over and over and over again. God was truly behind this idea. This is where I'm resting. This is what I told you to build. Build it in my, build it for me. And so, yeah.
I was just gonna ask, do we know how old Solomon was when he died?
Not off the top of my head. I don't have that off the top of my head.
Back then, people used to live 700 to 800 years.
Yeah, it wasn't quite that long because I want to say, for some reason, I want to say 90. Got that number from, but I want to say it has something to do with 90. Or maybe it's somewhere. I'm sure there's some accounts or somewhere you can find it. Solomon does live longer than his father David, but he's not. He's kind of like the only one that lives super long in comparison. Saul dies in battle, so he's dying relatively young. David, it's kind of described he's dying because of complications of what he was doing when he was younger. His body's just worn out. Well, Solomon, guy who's never known war, never really has any quarrels. It doesn't go through the same stress, and so his body is in slightly better shape. However, at the same time, he's become old and he's become stubborn, and he's decided to forsake what's good for evil. So there's part of that also being fed into it as well. And of course, the other kings after this, there's a lot of them that either die in battle or captured and killed. There's a lot of quick turnaround. What we saw with Jeremiah. Jeremiah is told, go preach to Josiah, who at the beginning of his reign was 8 years old. Usually 8-year-olds don't become king unless their father died young. So it's one of those, there's quick turnover. Some of the kings of Israel are only kings for like months. And so it's because they became king and then they went up to battle and immediately got defeated. And so, but Solomon, on the other hand, is one of the only ones that truly lives a full life. The understanding is it's longer than David because David did take care of his body when he was young. He was in a battle. He was fighting. He was killing giants. And so there's a lot of there's just some of those small differences in what his health is implied to be.
Do we know the books that Solomon wrote, if they were after the temple was completed? Or
A lot of the books. It's always hard to date books of the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, because we know they at least come from the 2nd century BC, because that's where we have the first complete Greek Old Testament. Copying it off something, but we have the first well-documented, well-recorded Greek Old Testament, which is much longer than what our Old Testament is, because it includes some of those books like the Wisdom of Solomon, it includes extra Psalms, it includes some of those things. And so kind of what you see is the understanding is they're written around the time of Solomon. It's definitely not in those later years, because in those later years he's almost completely forsaken God. He's gone and said, I'm not going to worship God, I'm not going to go to the temple. So I think you could even argue God takes the wisdom away, lets him wallow in his folly, do wicked things. He hands him over into his sins, to kind of repeat what Paul says in Romans, of God handed him over into their own destruction. And so what we have is, it's pretty safe to say, when he's young, when he's doing the good things, when he's in the favor of God, that's when he's right. Because also, when you're waiting 7 years to build the temple and 13 more years before you can build your house, you have plenty of downtime because you're not fighting wars. So,
yeah, it's contrary to you think of most people gaining wisdom throughout their life versus the latest of Solomon.
Solomon loses wisdom as he ages. He almost immediately gained favor with God and then just slowly lost it. I think, I'm sure there's a sermon in there somewhere. But yeah. That's kind of all I have for this week. Thank you all for listening.
No, thank you, Bergan.
This bug keeps attacking me, so maybe I need to move.
Maybe it's telling me it's time.
Yeah, it's telling me, all right,